Hello and welcome to Investing Inspiration for 2022, the webinar that's part of a campaign by AJ Bell called Money Matters. It's designed to help more women get invested. We'd love to make this interactive and to hear from you, so please do use the chat box function if you want to ask us a question, and we'll get back to you later by email. At present, only around a third of AJ Bell's customers, whether they come directly or through a financial advisor, are women. And obviously that should be more like 50-50 representing the population. And clearly it's equally important that women's financial well-being is looked after as men's. Now, it's not just our customer base that's skewed towards men. You're probably familiar with the gender pay gap, which now stands at around 8% for full-time employees. But the gender investment gap across the whole country is much, much wider. It's more than 50%, 50. British women have, on average, just 49,000 put away, excluding their property, compared with £114,000 on average for men. And that all adds up to a gender investment gap across the whole country of £1.65 trillion. And every month, I'm afraid that gap is getting wider because women are setting aside just £180 a month as savings, compared with men's £306. That's enough numbers now. So I guess what the question is why is the investment gap so huge? There's actually a few reasons, and individually, none of them seem to be that significant. But when you put them all together, you get this vast impact. Now, earning less, I mentioned the gender pay gap, is of course one key reason, but we have been seeing the pay gap narrow over the long term, although actually it widened a little bit during the pandemic. Now, I and other people are doing as much as we can to try to continue to improve the career opportunities for women, but that's going to take some time. We also tend to take more career breaks, often around having a family, and more of us work part-time. So all of that doesn't help, but we're, on top of that, also tend to be very reluctant to put our savings to work. We tend to leave our savings on deposit, earning very little interest in the bank. Now, there's been lots of attempts to try to work out why, and here's my interpretation based really on my personal experience. So as I look back on my own investment history, I'm conscious of three main reasons why I was very slow to get involved, even though I work in financial markets. Firstly, the choice and the overwhelming number of decisions that have to be taken, or so it seems, is daunting. Now, remember, I was a professional investor, but I was investing in a very narrow range of assets. And I couldn't really work out where to start when it came to looking after my own money and planning for the future. And part of the problem was that the information seemed to be all over the place. And related to that, I guess I didn't feel I had enough time to devote to really gain enough expertise across all the different instrument types and all the different tax opportunities and so forth. So I just didn't feel I had enough time to become an expert. Now, secondly, I hate being patronized to or sold to. I really want someone, if I'm going to trust somebody to give me advice, I really want someone who I feel understands me, gets me as a person. Or I want the information available to be presented very objectively if I'm going to make my own decision. I just also really hate it when people are so obviously trying to sell you something. It makes me worried that I'm going to lose something, that I'm going to be ripped off in some way. And thirdly, I guess as I look back, I've realized that I have tended to worry too much about having access to my money. I have a large family, and I've learned that there's always something around the corner that might not be foreseeable. And so I guess I've tended to be rather cautious about making sure that I have enough access to my money and be nervous about tying it up. But what I learned to do, realizing that actually it was costing me by not investing, was to take one step at a time. So I didn't try to do everything all at once. And in my own case, it might not be the first step that you take, but I decided to take out a stocks and shares ISA. I invested in an inexpensive index fund that also had a tilt towards companies that were doing sort of more to help gender diversity and also to improve climate change. And I didn't invest all in one go, as I wanted to get comfortable with what I was investing in. So most providers, I think actually all, will allow you to gradually put your money in. You don't have to use up all your allowance if you take out a stocks and shares ISA all in one go. And that's a really good thing because you get to see how the value changes. You just gradually get more comfortable. You get reports from the manager and so forth. Next, I sorted out my pension. And I haven't worked for a huge number of employers, but I have worked for several. So bits of pension were lying all over the place. And I gathered them all together in one place. Again, sounded daunting, sounded difficult, but once I got started, it proved relatively straightforward. And then I started to think about the type of risk that I might take now that I'm 55. I also went through my bank account with a fine-tooth comb and I cancelled all those subscriptions or memberships that I no longer used, which did save me quite a lot of money. Now, all of that took a little bit of time, but it didn't take endless full days, which I don't really have. All I did was I treated it like getting physically fit, or at least fitter than I normally would be, a little bit at a time. I tried to do an hour here or there. And in fact, I set aside time on a Sunday afternoon just to try to gradually, I suppose, overcome my reticence and get involved. And overall, now that I've done those few things, it's made me feel calmer. It's made me feel less worried about one thing in my life. It's made me feel more in control of my future. And my own personal hope, as someone who cares greatly about equal opportunities for women, is that Money Matters helps more women take those first steps to sorting out their finances. And with that, of course, their financial well-being for the future. And then together, we will eventually close that gender investment gap. And now I'd like to hand over to Laura Suter, who's head of personal finance at AJ Bell. She's going to talk about how to take those important first steps to get invested, and also how to navigate what can seem a bit of a confusing maze between ISAs and pensions, or whether you should be using both.
So thanks a lot to Helena. Yeah, I'm going to be discussing how you determine whether you should be investing and how to get started. And then my colleague Danny is going to talk a bit about, once you've got those basics sorted, where you should be investing, particularly with markets as they are at the moment. So first, I think we should think about why you should invest versus just leaving your money in cash. And I think this chart is really interesting. So what it shows is that pale pink line is interest rates that you're getting, the average rate you're getting on cash savings accounts. And that has obviously been dwindling over the past few years. The other line, the more red line, is inflation at the moment. So that's the amount that prices are rising by. And that has shot up recently. It's about 5% at the moment and is expected to go even higher this year. And so what that means is any money sitting in cash is not earning very much interest, and also it's losing its spending power if we look over a year, for example. So say inflation hits 6% this year, which is what lots of people expect it to do. That then kind of becomes your bottom line, your ballpark of how much you need your money to earn just to keep pace with rising prices. That's obviously a very high hurdle and is impossible to get in cash savings accounts. And so that's why the argument for investing is a bit more compelling at the moment. Some people might remember a time where you could open an easy access savings account, you could earn 5% on it pretty easily without shopping around too much. And at that time, inflation was a lot lower. Those days are gone for now anyway. And so that means that any money sitting in cash is not earning very much interest. And so it means that it's a good chance to assess whether investing might be better for you to potentially get a higher return. And I wanted to take you through some examples of how just putting away a little bit of money can have a big impact. So I think when lots of people think about investing, they think, okay, well, I need to have thousands of pounds sitting there ready to go, and put that into investing at once. But that's not the case. You can actually save as little as £25 a month into your investment account, and you don't need to start with kind of huge swathes of cash. And I thought it would be helpful to actually put some figures behind that. So what we've got here is an example of someone who puts £50 a month away, and if they invest that money, after 10 years they've got almost £8,000. And so I think when you're thinking about investing, if you think about the future you and what future you could do with that money, rather than just focusing on potentially, the sacrifice you're making now. But what these figures also highlight is the benefit of putting that money in cash. So these examples look at the same £50 a month being put away over 10 years, but the investing example assumes you're earning 5% return a year, which is kind of the long return that markets have provided. The cash example looks at earning 0.5% a year, which is actually more than some people will be earning on their cash savings. And so here you can see the difference. You've made almost £1,800 extra in this kind of theoretical example if you'd invested the money rather than leaving it in cash. And if we look at that over an even longer time frame, so if we extend that same £50 a month contribution, but we look at you doing that over a 20-year period, you can really see the impact that has investing the money versus saving it in cash. So there you've got more than £8,000 extra you would have made by investing it. And that's because of something called compounding, which sounds a bit complicated, but it's essentially the fact that you're getting returns on the interest that you get. So that 5% a year growth that we assumed for investments, in the first year you'd get that on the money you put in the next year and all the subsequent years you'd get that interest on the money you've paid in, but also the previous interest you've earned. And that process, which is called compounding, can really help kind of put the rockets up your investing over longer periods of time. So coming away from those slides now, I thought it would be useful to go through some of the things, if you're thinking about starting investing, some of the things you should think about. And I think the first things are you need to think about how much you're going to invest or how much you want to build up over a certain period of time, and also what you're investing for. Those are kind of the only things you really need to know before you start investing. I'm also going to run through some of the options of different accounts that you could have. But firstly, I think if you almost think of a little checklist that you might need before you start investing. And so the first one is to think about any debt that you might have. If you've got debt that's costing you a lot of money, it's on a high interest rate, then you probably need to think about tackling that first. That's largely because the interest you'll be paying on that debt will probably be higher than any returns you could make investing. And so your money, any spare cash you have, will be better put towards paying off that debt. The next thing that you need to think about is the cash savings that you want to have. So how much cash savings you have, and how much you really need. So you need to think about any money that you might want in an emergency pot, any money you want for short-term savings goals, so things like a wedding or a holiday coming up or buying a new car, any kind of size of thing. You need to think about the cash you need to set aside for that. And then after that, you need to work out how much money you've got spare each month. So you don't need to necessarily do a forensic analysis of your accounts and your incomings and outgoings, but it's worth thinking about how much roughly you tend to have spare at the end of each month, or if you don't, thinking about areas where you could make savings so that you could release a little bit of money each month to start investing. And then the final thing you really need to think about is what you're saving for. For some people, this might just be a bit more of a kind of woolly goal of they just want to put some money away for the future and they just want to start investing, but they don't have a specific thing in mind. For other people, it will be much clearer cut. It will be something like they want to save for a house deposit, or they want to bolster their pension and put more money away for their retirement. This matters because it depends partly how much risk you're likely to take with your investments, so the type of investments that you'd pick, but it also matters what type of account you would pick. So for example, if you think about if you were saving for a house deposit and you were going to buy a house in 8 years' time, you might take very different choices with your investments and your risk level than, for example, if you were saving in your pension and you weren't going to touch that money for 30 or even 40 years. So it's important to think, it's almost like your destination, like when you go for a drive, your goal is what you're thinking about, how you're going to spend that money ultimately. So now I think it's worth going through some of the account options. There's lots of different options and account names out there, and I think that can be a bit bewildering for people that are starting out with investing. So I thought it would be useful to try and break that down into simpler terms, and try and look at some of the pros and cons of each account type. So let's start with pensions. Through a thing called auto enrollment, most people will now have a pension. That means that your company, most companies now, in fact, pretty much every company has to offer you a pension. This means that you'll get a little bit of money from your employer, and you'll put in some money. And that's one of the big bonuses of pensions, is essentially free money from your employer. Different companies will do different levels of matching, and it's definitely worth checking out what your company offers and whether you're maximising that money if you can afford to do so. The other massive benefit of pensions is that the government adds what's called tax relief on top. Now, the amount that this is depends on the tax bracket that you sit in, whether you're a basic rate taxpayer or a higher rate or additional rate. But essentially, you get that income tax back on your pension contributions, and that helps to boost your pot, but also means that your contributions effectively cost you a bit less when they come out of your pay packet. One of the pros is that you can't raid the pot, so you can't think, if you're having a bit of a lean month, that you can dip into it. That is also obviously one of the cons, is that you can't touch the money. So that money is tied up until you retire, and you can't take the money out before then. So the money you're putting into this, you really need to think about, is very long term. It's money you put away and forget about, and you're not going to have access to. So it's important to think about that when you think about how much you're putting in. You don't want to overstretch yourself, and then regret having put that money in. Because of that, it means you can invest for the long term. So for some people, that will mean that they can take a bit more risk with their investments. If you've got 20, 30, maybe even 40 years until you're going to take that money out, you can afford to kind of ride out the ups and downs of the market a little bit more. And then obviously the negative is it's not good for short-term savings. If you know that you're going to need access to that money, even in 10 years' time, this is not the option for you. And so then if we go on to ISAs, they're probably the simplest account. And it's worth mentioning that all of these accounts, so pensions, ISA, lifetime ISA, all of them are tax efficient accounts. So what that means in practice is you don't pay any income or capital gains tax on the money in them, which makes them particularly good for investing, because it means that the returns you get are tax free. With an ISA also, any money you take out of it, you don't pay tax on it either. You can pay in up to £20,000 a year into an ISA, which is a pretty hefty amount. That's more than most people would have spare each year. And the great thing about ISAs is they're easy access. You can access the money whenever you want to. So if you put in some money one month, you can then withdraw it the next month if you needed to. Now, if you're thinking about investing, you should be thinking about ideally not really touching that money for 5 years so that it stays invested. But it is useful to know that if you're in a pinch, you could access that money. There's also flexibility with the money that you put in. So you can put in a monthly amount, regular amount, or you can put in lump sums. So if, for example, you've got a bonus from work, or you've got some money for your birthday, you could add that in as a lump sum, but you could also set up that kind of regular monthly payment going in. But the big downside is that there's none of that kind of free money to add to it. There's no government top up in the form of kind of tax relief like there is with pensions, and there's no employer contribution like there is with pensions either. So you're kind of on your own with this money, but it is a kind of easy account to use. And then finally, if we come on to the lifetime ISA, so this is a little bit more complicated, but it is a brilliant account for certain people. So the big appeal of the lifetime ISA is that the government will add a 25% bonus to any money you put in, up to £1,000 a year. So you can put in £4,000 a year, and then the government will top that up with an extra £1,000. You can put in less and they'll still top it up with that 25% bonus. And then otherwise it has similar traits to the normal ISA that I talked about before. So you can add to it easily with monthly payments or lump sums. There's a wide range of investments that you can pick within it. But it has more restrictions than a normal ISA, which is where it sits somewhere in between a normal ISA and a pension. So you can't just raid the pot whenever you want to. You couldn't just dip into that money. We can do, but you face an exit penalty for doing so. So any money that you take out that's not for the two specific purposes it's intended for, which is buying a first home or saving for your retirement. If you take out money for any other reason, then you'll pay a 25% kind of exit penalty for it. 25% of your withdrawal will be taken away. So it has a lower limit. I mentioned that £4,000 that you can put in. That's the maximum you can put in each tax year. That actually comes out of your £20,000 ISA allowance that you had before. So if you're in the fortunate position to have that money spare each year and you put £4,000 in your lifetime ISA, you'd still only be able to put £16,000 in your normal ISA. But obviously for lots of people that's not necessarily attainable. So let's talk a bit about the two purposes for it. So buying your first home or for your retirement. Let's take the first one. So for buying your first home, this is great. The bonus that the government is going to give you is pretty much unbeatable. And then if you're investing that money too, the returns you're going to get on that will hopefully help to boost your house deposit. You can only use it if you're a first-time buyer, and that includes any property that you might have been gifted or inherited. You can only use it for that purpose. There's a limit on the value of the property that you can use, which is you can only buy a property worth up to £450,000, which is obviously a lot of money. In some areas where property is pricier, that might be a bit of a barrier for some people. But you can use it if you're buying with someone else, and you can both use a lifetime ISA and both get that bonus money and use it towards your deposit, which is great. For the retirement purposes, the other reason that you can take out the money is when you reach the age of 60. So when you take that money out at that point, you can use it to supplement your retirement income. And the other thing to note is that there's an age restriction. So you can only open the account if you're aged between 18 and 40. If you're over 40 or under 18, then you wouldn't be able to open the account. And then you carry on paying in until you're 50. So it's a little bit more complicated than a standard ISA, but it's definitely worthwhile looking into it if you are buying a first home. Whether this is better than a pension is much more specific to your circumstances. There's not as much of a clear-cut rule. And we've got lots of great articles on the UInvest website kind of weighing up the pros and cons. But as a rule of thumb, you don't get an employer contribution to a lifetime ISA. So if you haven't maximised that employer contribution in your pension, or that kind of free money that you're getting from your employer in your pension, then a pension is probably going to be better for you if you're just using this to save for retirement. However, if you've maximised that, and then this might be a better option, but you've really got to weigh up things like what tax bracket you're in, and it gets a little bit more complicated, so definitely do some more reading around that before you make that decision. So I think also once we're looking at those accounts, what we need to think about it is it's not necessarily that there's going to be one that's perfect for you. So it might be that you want to save some money towards your house deposit and you're a first-time buyer, and you think lifetime ISA would be great for you, and you can put some money in that, but that doesn't stop you perhaps using your pension, for example, and maximising that free money that your employer is going to give you, or using a normal ISA if you've got kind of different spending goals as well. So it's just thinking through which has the perks that would appeal to you and how you can allocate your money. And there's not really one clear right answer, which makes it a bit trickier, but it just depends on what's going to be right for you. So hopefully that was all helpful, and you'll be hearing from my colleague about once you've decided how to invest, where you should be putting that money. Thanks.
Finally, let's hear from Danny Hewson, who's a financial analyst at AJ Bell, And she's going to address what to do with your money in an environment of rising inflation, a hot topic at present.
Hello, I'm Danny, and I'm going to talk a little bit about investing. Going to try and demystify some of the words and phrases you might have seen used, and also talk you through a little bit about what's happening now and how that might affect your decision making. Now, many of you might just feel that at the moment your money is burning up. Lots of households are really feeling the squeeze, and there are a whole load of reasons for that. And of course, COVID is behind many of them. We've still got supply chains all snarled up, and it is having a massive impact upon our finances, and it is having a massive impact on where people are thinking about putting their investments. So I'm going to talk you a little bit through how inflation is impacting investments and markets and what maybe you should be looking at. Okay, so that is the inflation picture. You might have heard economists talking about Goldilocks when it comes to inflation. That is because a little bit of inflation is actually a good thing, but not too much. We don't want too much. We don't want the economy too hot or too cold, hence Goldilocks. Now, the Bank of England has a magic number of 2%. That is their inflation target. And over the last decade or so, things have been fairly on track. So that is in part down to a lot to do with sort of tech and automation, making us all more productive. But right now, look where that big red line is. That is at 5.1%. And I'm afraid it is expected to go much higher. Economists saying 6, maybe even 7, and it is set to stay high for a lot of months. And it's just something that we're not used to. It means basically that every pound buys a bit less than it did. Wage growth, of course, it just hasn't kept pace. So in real terms, you are paying more and earning less. Now, it also means that your savings are worth less comparatively because they won't go as far. They won't buy you as much as maybe they would have done when inflation was 2% or less. But the one thing that I would say, the one thing that the last few years has taught us all is that it is still really important to save. In fact, now more so than ever. Laura has spoken to you about lots of different ways to invest. Well, I'm here to talk about what to invest in when inflation is on the rise. And, making sure also that you're protected if inflation drops away very quickly. Now, right now, while a lot of people are really worried about their household budgets, they might be really feeling the squeeze, they might think that they don't have money to save. And of course, if you've been putting your cash into the bank, you haven't been getting an awful lot of bang for your buck. In fact, interest rates really over the last decade have pretty much flatlined. So I did a bit of number crunching, and if you'd have saved £100 a month over the last 10 years, you'd have amassed £12,000. And as a bonus for all of your hard work, if you'd been able to get hold of interest rates at the baseline, well, you'd have made just under 250 quid. But if you had invested the same amount in something that tracks the FTSE All Share, for example, which, as it suggests, holds all the shares in London, big, small, on the London Stock Exchange, well, then you would have made over £2,000 more if you'd left it alone. Because when you look at that chart, this is one of the things we were talking about risk. Helen was talking about risk earlier. And you can see that it has been pretty volatile. So if you'd have taken your money out on one of those troughs, then there was a good chance that you would lose money. But if you put it in over time, then it does average out. And it is the risk that does tend to put a lot of people off. Now, when we're talking about what to look for when you're investing, there are a lot of words and phrases that people use. So on there, we've got all the different types of global assets and how they have performed over the last year, that the total return that people got from them. So on there, you've got commodities. That's basically stuff, things like gold and metal. You've got developed equities, global equities, emerging equities. Now, equities are basically shares or investments made in individual companies so that you own part of it. And the companies are listed on stock exchanges all around the world, whether it be in London, on the FTSE, or of course, you'll have heard of Wall Street. New York has the NASDAQ, it has the S&P and the Dow Jones. Those are what are typically known as established markets. They're the developed equities that are on that chart there. Then you've got global equities, which of course is the whole world, and you've got emerging equities. These are markets like China and India. You've also got on there bonds. Now, bonds are often seen as less risky investments. This is when you're lending money to a company or even the government. Government bonds are often called gilts. Now, in return, you get paid interest on the loan. Of course, some companies and governments are more stable than others, and bondholders are much further up the list of investors to be repaid, so tend to be much less risky. But as with all investments, of course, you must be aware there is a chance that you could lose your whole investment. Remember, stock markets go up and they also go down. But the reason we're looking at this chart over the last year is this gives you an idea of where investors were putting their money over the last year in preparation for those higher inflation levels that we are seeing. And this is why commodities have really sort of outperformed the way they did over the last 5 years. And that is because it's often seen by investors as something of a safe haven. There's also been a bit of a shift in the kind of equities that people have been buying. We always hear about, those big companies like Apple and Microsoft, those huge tech companies. Well, they are what's called jam tomorrow companies. Those are growth companies. They tend to have an awful lot of debt. And when you're thinking about rising inflation, rising interest rates, you don't want to see that kind of debt. You've also, of course, with household squeeze, you've got people really thinking about where they're spending their money. They're not going to buy the nice to haves. And this is why old-fashioned brands, consumer brands that can continue to sell their goods and pass on that extra price right to consumers, they really come into their own. So, the likes in London of Tate & Lyle, Unilever, and some of the banks like Lloyds Bank, that is where a lot of people are looking at putting their money. Now, when we're talking about investing, a lot of people, when they're starting out, they get really nervous. They think, I don't know where to put my money. I don't understand which company to invest in. And that is why we have funds. This is where somebody pulls a whole load of funds all together in one place, a whole load of equities. And it could be because they come from the same part of the world, or it could be because they are ethical. There's been a lot of talk of ethical investing recently, and that is where people are really getting interested in the market where they haven't potentially been before. And you can have a whole load of equities, investments in shares, which are in one fund, which are banded under an equity, which is ESG investing. So you can look for a fund like that. Another thing that a lot of funds tend to do now is they will brand themselves according to risk. So you can see how volatile your investment might be. And if you're a nervous investor, a first-time investor, you might be wanting something with less risk. So that is where funds really do come into their own. Now, we were talking about commodities, and metal really matters. And when we start to get high inflation, a lot of people talk about putting money into gold, but it's seen as a safe port in a storm, although gold prices haven't increased as much these days. And this is where, when you're looking historically, you also need to look through the lens of today. Because if you think about the kind of metal which we use an awful lot of and will be using an awful lot of over the next few years, well, things like copper perhaps might be of more interest because they're used in car batteries, and we've got a lovely Tesla there. And of course, the world is very much changing. It's not just changing because of COVID, although we do have to think really, really carefully about the COVID factor, because another place that investors do tend to put money in with rising inflation is property. And the property sector has been absolutely on fire because of COVID. Of course, lots of people have maybe thought differently about where they want to live. We've seen house prices skyrocket. People have had more savings. They've been more able perhaps to buy a house than they were before. And the property sector is really on fire. Another thing is those property funds, which people might have used in the past, big question marks over those at the moment, so you can't put money into there. So at the moment, you might be considering something called a REIT. So if you think about the number of Amazon warehouses that are cropping up all over the place, well, lots of warehouses right across the country are being used, and there are specific REITs which basically buy up that kind of property that you can invest in. So again, you know, these different terms, which can sound really scary, they're basically just a jumping together of property when you're talking about a REIT. And in other times, perhaps you might have been thinking about investing in those big companies that have retail space. You have to think about what COVID has done to the retail landscape and how retail is going to recover. So I would just say, when you are thinking about investing, yes, look historically, but also think about what's going on at the moment. We don't know how many new variants we might come up against over the next 12 months. We don't really know yet exactly how the global economy is going to deal effectively with Omicron. So there are still lots of question marks. And when we're talking about inflation, I think it's really important to stress that we don't know how long this rising inflation is going to continue. Last year, a lot of people were talking about the fact that they thought inflation was going to be transitory, that it was only going to be around for a short time because of COVID issues like those supply chain backlogs. But actually, it's stuck around a lot longer than a lot of people thought, and it's set to stick around more. Just think about rising energy prices and how that is going to squeeze. But as you can see from here, when you're looking at what to put in your portfolio, all the different bits and pieces you might want to invest your money in, it changes depending on whether we are in a period of inflation, deflation, or that dreaded term stagflation. A lot of economists have been really worried that we would get stuck with higher prices and perhaps falling growth, which is a really difficult place for an economy to be in. So I would just say, the one thing about investing is that it's really important to make sure that you diversify your portfolio. Yes, by all means, take what I've just said about looking for commodities, looking for those value stocks, those consumer staples, and think about, if you're going to invest, adding them to your portfolio, but don't get rid of absolutely everything. If you're investing, you need to be thinking about investing for the long term. So don't just clear out everything because you're nervous about what's coming over the next 12 months. You should be thinking about the next 12, 20 years. So make sure that whatever investment you have, it is spread across a whole variety of things. And if you are at all worried, concerned, nervous, I would always suggest to go for financial advice, because there are some very smart people out there that are really helpful when it comes to making those kind of decisions.
So now let's pull it all together and chat about some of the themes that we've already introduced. So welcome back, Laura and Danny. Laura, would you like to kick us off?
Of course, yeah. So we've got some questions that we've had in from people, but I think maybe if we come to them later, I think it might just be interesting for us to expand a bit on some of the things that we've talked about. I think, Helena, your point initially in your introduction about being a bit too cautious and that holding you back from investing really resonated with me. I think I'm always far too concerned with having too much cash, probably being too risk averse when that money could be invested, and I don't actually need access to that money at short-term notice. And I think probably from speaking to a lot of my friends, a lot of them are the same. They worry about the risks involved with investing more than seeing the potential upside of it. And I think that is quite a difference between men and women, particularly among my kind of straw poll among my friends, which is not really scientifically robust, but
it's probably something that resonates with Danny and me. So I mean, I think that there is that, and yet sometimes people dispute it and say, actually, no, everybody's just the same. And I think just subtly the nuances, the difference in our behaviors, you know, it's not the great gulf. It's just slightly, on average, we're slightly more cautious, slightly more nervous about losing things. And I think there's evidence as well, perhaps, that suggests that women aren't motivated by the idea of just making money. We're more motivated by the idea of saving and investing to achieve certain goals, like paying off a mortgage or our old age or children's education, something like that. So there does need to be, I think, a slightly different approach taken to attracting women to invest, and to invest in a way that makes them feel comfortable.
What's been really interesting, something I've found with a lot of female investors that I've been speaking to over the last year or so, is the move into ethical investing has really made people start discussing where to put their money, not just to make money, but to see that money actually help build a better future, not just for them and their families, but also, you know, globally, to help in terms of climate change, to help in terms of, you know, social governance, to make sure that they're putting money into companies that look after their workforce. And I think COVID made a huge change to that, because we saw a big backlash where companies weren't looking after their workforce, you know, where they were making them work, perhaps they weren't putting in the right checks and balances in place, the right PPE. And I think that has been a really good way to get people to start talking about things like funds. Who knew? I didn't work in finance up until very recently, and I didn't know a great deal about things like funds. You know, a lot of it seems like a foreign language, and I think that's really off-putting to a lot of women.
Yeah, no, I think we are guilty as charged as an industry for not speaking in plain English. Sometimes people hide behind the regulations and say, oh, we have to use all this terminology. But of course, if people, again, don't understand, I think women are very smart. If we don't understand something, we don't want to actually take the plunge, do we? I mean, that's smart, not anything else. And we've got to, I think, meet people where they are in all of this. And hopefully by telling stories, by showing that actually it's ordinary, everyday thing to do, to invest, rather than something esoteric. And I agree with you entirely, Danny, by the way, that I think that responsible investing is a real sort of hook to try to encourage people to think, actually, this is not just about, you know, capitalism going mad. This is actually about supporting the evolution of business that I support and want to invest in.
So let's jump to a few of the questions that we've had in now, because I think some of them touch on a lot of these points. So the first one is more about how you prioritize your money. So someone says that they're saving for a house, but they don't want to totally abandon their pension. So what should they do? And I think this is a challenge that's facing a lot of younger people today. It takes so much longer to save for a house deposit these days. And that means that rather than thinking, oh, well, I just won't put into my pension for a couple of years, actually that can stretch over a really long period of time. So Helena, I guess, how did you balance those competing demands?
Well, I must admit, it certainly resonates, because when I was young, and we never seemed to have quite enough money, you know, when we were having children, and mortgage rates at that stage were very, very high, double-digit interest rates, which is hard to imagine now. And we had this albatross around our neck, it felt like, in terms of the mortgage. But I think the key is to make sure that you don't give up free money. So obviously, if you're young, you don't need your pension now, but you need to sort of be thinking about it a little bit. You need to prioritize where you live and make sure that you have a roof over your head. But you should be auto-enrolled into a company pension scheme if you're employed and earning over £10,000. Don't opt out of it, because your employer is putting in some free money on your behalf. So take that as a gift, where make sure you don't just sort of cut it down to the bone. You'll usually have to match that and so forth, and put in a small contribution yourself. But if it leaves your bank account before you've even seen it, you'll get used to managing what's left. I just wouldn't invest more money than you need to when you're very young, and it's still looking out for, how to get your foot on the property ladder.
And I think the big thing to think about is it isn't permanent. You can decide how much to put in your pension and how much to put in an ISA or a lifetime ISA, for example. And if you get 6 months down the line and you think, well, this balance isn't quite right, it's very easy to change it. So I think often people get paralyzed by thinking, okay, well, I've got to make this decision and then that's it. That's set in stone. And it is now much easier to kind of log on to accounts and change amounts. And so I think people should trial it. It's better to start out, trial it, and then if it doesn't go quite right, or you don't think you've got the balance quite right, or things in your life change, then you can change it too.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that if money is going out before it hits your bank account, then you don't notice it in the same way as if you have to make a conscious decision when you see that amount going in. Okay, well, I'd like to use that for a holiday, or I want to put that towards a house, or, I've got to use that amount to live on, so I won't bother to invest. It makes a big difference. And of course, particularly when women are younger, they tend to be earning more on a level playing field with men. So if you can keep your pension going in your 20s before you start to think about having children, then it can make a massive difference when you get into your 50s and 60s.
Because I know that the research that AJ Bell conducted showed that 41% of women felt that taking a career break or going part-time had a negative impact on their financial fitness, their well-being, their future. It's almost, I suppose, tautological that, if you take a foot off the pedal over your career at some point, you will slide backwards. To get as far ahead as you can when you're not in that position. And hopefully we'll keep moving the world of work forward so that actually women can still work and bring up their young children, and perhaps not have to make that binary decision that used to have to be made.
So the next question kind of touches on some of the things we were talking about before. So I'm not very risky and I have most of my savings in cash. When's the right time to start investing? And should I have a certain amount saved up before I get started? I think some of my presentation tackled some of this, that you can start little and often. You don't need to have kind of thousands of pounds built up behind you before you can start investing. You can literally start from £25 a month. But I think everyone's definition of how much they should have in cash is very different. Some people will be more risk averse than others. Some people will find that it's much easier to sleep at night if they've got more money sitting in cash that they can fall back on should they lose their job or hit some other kind of emergency situation. Other people will be much more happy having less there and feel like they can invest more. So I think there's no hard and fast rule, which makes it a bit harder because you can't just look at a formula and work out what's right for you. I think it's just thinking about what you're comfortable with and what your risk tolerance is, which is the same with lots of areas of their life. For example, some people would buy a house and use every single penny of their savings and get the maximum mortgage they could get. Other people might feel that would cause them sleepless nights, and so they're a bit more risk averse in that. And so with investing, it is the same as well.
And the only thing I'd add to that, Laura, is I think that part of the question that's asking about, when is the right time to invest? There's a saying of, time in the market is much more valuable than timing the market. And actually, it's really hard to time the market. And obviously, equity markets, stock markets have been quite strong over the last year or so. And people might feel nervous and think, oh, well, I'll wait for a pullback. But do it gradually. Don't invest all your eggs in one basket on one day. Make sure that you build your confidence and you don't, perhaps if you invest and then markets fall a little bit, well, you can invest a little bit more. But getting into this habit of investing, as you say, little and often, treating it like sort of not quite cleaning your teeth, because you don't do it every day necessarily, but, building up these good financial well-being habits, then you end up sort of become second nature rather than thinking this is a big sort of, major leap forward. It's just a little step.
There's never a right time either, I don't think. And if you can think about it in the same way that you think about, subscription to Netflix, if you can put a similar amount aside as a start every month, then that is a really good foundation. And I think once you have been bitten by the savings bug, when you start to see your money work for you, then you feel more comfortable. And also the thing is that you can take a look at different products, and you can have some tied up for a lengthy period of time, so you can't access it until you hit pension age, but you can have other pots which you can access far more readily if you happen to need it because something has happened in your life. Maybe you've lost your job, or perhaps, you know, like with COVID, you're unable to work for a period of time. So I think it is about just, there's never a right time, just take the plunge.
And Danny, this is probably a good question for you. So someone's saying, I want to start investing, but how do I know which investments to pick? And I think this is such a common issue. I mean, it comes back to the jargon point that we were talking about earlier. People think, okay, right, I've sorted out all of these things we're talking about. I've decided how much I can invest. I've picked my account. But now, how do I pick a fund or a tracker? Or, I mean, it can be pretty overwhelming, can't it?
There are so many options available to people out there. It is incredibly overwhelming. I think one of the things which has happened in the last few years is the labels on particular funds have changed. So you get a real indication of what's in the tin. So if you're wanting something which is aimed at looking after the climate, is what we call an ESG fund, then you can find an ethical fund. Funds basically are where you have a whole mix of different equities, different companies all in one box, and you effectively have that managed, and you put in a little bit of that along with lots of other people. So you're not the one picking the different companies to put in that box. Somebody else is doing that for you. And funds are a really good way of accessing the market to start with. Another thing that I would say is that, you know, we all live in the world. There are a lot of companies which you can buy shares in, have a part of, which you use every day. You understand their value. You can see how well they're doing. You can just take a quick look and see their profits and how much revenue they're making, and you can make a decision as to whether or not you want to invest in that company. It is scary. It is scary. There's no doubt about it. If you're not able to look at, you know, the financial pages every day, if you're not working in the financial sector, it can be quite daunting. But everybody is in the same boat when you first get into it. And I think those funds are really useful. They'll also gauge your risk as well. So if you're thinking, okay, I'm starting out, maybe I want something with moderate risk rather than something which is adventurous, then you can put your money into that. And the other thing that I would say is don't look at it every day, because the stock market is volatile, particularly right now with COVID. It can be up stratospheric heights 1 minute and down right at the bottom, and you think, I've lost all my money the next minute. So if you're looking every day, it can be really scary. So just make sure that maybe once every 6 months you check in, make sure that whatever you've got in your pot is working for you.
And that is it. I just want to build on that, because the emotional side of it is something that I know causes lots of people to come a cropper, because it's inevitable that you're going to feel, you know, great hubris when markets are rising and want to invest more, and great fear when markets are falling and want to pull all your money out. But actually, history tells us you should try to fight that and do the opposite. And that's where coming back and doing something, as you said, like a Netflix subscription, where you're just kind of steady as they go, just putting the money in every month, then it means you're going to take advantage of those setbacks in the market. Over the long term, if you believe in, you know, economic growth, and if you believe in, you know, prosperity, then you will do better being in the market. So that concludes our webinar. We hope that you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're hoping that next time we can hold an in-person seminar, perhaps 2 in March. So please watch this space for more information. We'll keep you updated. Do follow us on social media. The handles are all now on the screen in front of me. And finally, we want these sessions to be really valuable to you. So please fill out the survey to give us your feedback and highlight areas and topics that you want to hear more about. Thank you and goodbye.